Welcome to unit number 6 of our series, Finding God Through Faith and Reason. Again, we are working on chapter 2 of the book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, and trying to address this content to people who might want to be more edified in their faith, and even some people who might be struggling with their faith that you might know. What we're going to do now is we're going to bring some closure to this metaphysical proof for the existence of God. And we saw in episode number 1 and number 2 that there had to be at least one unconditioned reality. And then in our second episode concerned with the metaphysical proof, we saw that one unconditioned reality would have to be absolutely simple, and because absolutely simple, unrestricted, and one. We saw that it had to be absolutely simple because the unrestricted reality, kind of like St. Thomas Aquinas' unrestricted power or unrestricted acting power or pure acting power, we saw that the unconditioned reality really had to be so simple that it could be compatible with anything, any possible thing which could be dependent on it for its reality. And it also, of course, had to be even simpler than that. It has to be even compatible with itself. So for that reason, we saw that the unconditioned reality had to be at the top of the tree of being. We then noticed that because it was up at the top of the tree of being, that it had to be unrestricted. That is to say, absolute simplicity is unrestricted in the sense of having no restrictions or finitude or boundaries. We're speaking in the via negativa, the negative way. We can say what a thing is not, but we can't really say what it is, because if we lose it when we try to say what it is, because we'll put a restriction or a boundary on it. But we know it has no intrinsic or extrinsic boundaries because it is absolutely simple, because it does have to be compatible with every possible reality. Now, then, we saw that that meant it also had to be one and only one. Because, of course, if it's absolutely simple, if you postulate two absolute simplicities, right, there'd have to be something in one of the simplicities to make it, as it were, different from, or a different instance of, or a different instantiation of absolute simplicity than the first one. But whatever made it different, whatever made it a different instance, whatever made it a distinct instantiation of absolute simplicity, that couldn't be absolute simplicity. Because if it were absolute simplicity, then of course it would just be blended into the first act of absolute simplicity. All you'd have is undifferentiated absolute simplicity, which is one. But in point of fact, that's all you really do have. Because anytime you postulate a second absolute simplicity, it's going to be a fake. Anytime you postulate a second absolute simplicity, you'll always have to have something in it to differentiate it from the first one. And whatever it is that's differentiating it from the first one will be, of course, in some sense, not absolute simplicity. Therefore, it would have to be less simple than the first act of absolute simplicity, making it a fake absolute simplicity. So we see that then the unconditioned reality is one and only one. It is absolutely simple. It is absolutely unrestricted. That is to say, no intrinsic or extrinsic finitude or boundaries. And it is absolutely one. But St. Thomas goes further. St. Thomas says that this one being has to be the creator of all else that is. And not only the creator, but the continuous creator, if I might put it this way. The conserver, as it were, of all else that is. And the reason that St. Thomas says this is as follows. All we need to do is kind of go back to our very first unit. Let's just go back for a second to when we were talking about why there had to be at least one unconditioned reality. And remember when we were talking about that, we said, well, there were two things that we could have. We could have, you know, in all reality, you could have an unconditioned reality which had either a conditioned reality which had a finite number of dependencies, or a conditioned reality that had an infinite number of conditions or dependencies. Now let's just kind of take that straightforwardly for a second, and let's split it out. We know that for any conditioned reality, we know one thing from the very beginning. We know that it could not have an infinite number of conditions. That's the one thing we know from the beginning. For any conditioned reality, say a cat or a proton or whatever you like, that proton could not be dependent on an infinite number of conditions being fulfilled, because those conditions would not be fulfilled, in which case that proton would never come into existence. Okay, so we know that. So X that option out. You couldn't have infinite dependence. And then we said, therefore, you'd have to have finite dependence. You'd have to have then our cat or our proton would have to be dependent on a finite number of conditions being fulfilled. But if it were dependent on a finite number of conditions being fulfilled, then you'd have to have a last or a terminating condition. And if you had a last or a terminating condition, you have two options. Your last or terminating condition, why, it could be another conditioned reality, or it could be the unconditioned reality. Now, we already know the solution to this problem because we already saw it in step one. We know that the terminating or final condition below the quark somewhere, we know that that terminating condition could not be a conditioned reality. Why? Because if it were a conditioned reality, it would be a conditioned reality whose conditions were not fulfilled. And if it were a conditioned reality whose conditions were not fulfilled, then it would be nothing. And everything dependent on it would be nothing too. So our cat has only one option. Our cat has to be dependent on a finite number of conditions, which means it has a final or last condition, and we know what that final or last condition must be. It must be an unconditioned reality. Now, in the second place, we know, because an unconditioned reality has to be absolutely simple, because it has to be compatible with every possible reality, and therefore could not have a boundary which could exclude it from any possible conditioned reality. Therefore, we know that that absolutely simple, which has to be unrestricted in the sense of no extrinsic or intrinsic boundaries, has to be absolutely one. And there can be, therefore, one and only one unconditioned reality, which must lie at the bottom of the finite number of conditions which every conditioned reality is dependent on. That one and only one unconditioned reality, all second unconditioned realities are fakes, because they'll have to have something in them to differentiate them from the first one, which would make them less than absolutely simple. Boom, just that plain. Now, that one unconditioned reality, just lying at the bottom then of that line, it has to lie. That one unconditioned reality, because there's only one in the set of all reality, that has to be then the unconditioned reality which grounds not just our hypothetical cat, it has to ground every single solitary thing in reality. It's really easy to see this. Why is that? It is so because, just take a look for a second here. Just think for a second, I've got the set of all reality. How many unconditioned realities do I have in the set of all reality? One and only one. Therefore, what else is everything else in reality? If I only have one unconditioned reality in the set of all reality, what then is the rest of the set of all reality? Has to be conditioned realities.